Well, good morning. I am Paulo Sotero, the director of the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center. It's a pleasure to have you here for a discussion about the political outlook in Brazil in the wake of the municipal elections of last month and the global financial crisis. For those who are not aware of it, the Woodrow Wilson is the National Living Memorial honoring President Woodrow Wilson. It provides an essential link between the worlds of idea and public policy in order to address current and future domestic and global challenges. The Center fosters policy-relevant research and dialogue to enhance the capabilities and knowledge of public and private sector leaders, citizens, and institutions worldwide. It was created by an act of Congress. The Center is nonpartisan. It is supported by both public and private funds. With that, I would like to welcome Michael Shifter, that is a co-host of this event on behalf of the Inter-American Dialogue. I would like also to recognize Ambassador Antonio Patriota, Brazilian Ambassador to Washington, Ambassador John Danilovich, who was Ambassador of the United States to Brazil, Ambassador Luigi Einaudi, dear friend, in more than one way a supporter of the Brazil Institute, and a member of our advisory board. I also see here dear friends like Sidney Weintraub from the CSIS and Cynthia McClintock, who was a fellow at the Wilson Center Latin American Program. Cynthia Arnson, the director of the Latin American Program of the Wilson Center, has also joined us. And today's discussion, we have 4 speakers. Starting with David Fleischer, Professor Emeritus at the UNB, the University of Brasilia, and the person to go to not only in Washington, but particularly in Brazil, if you want to see the picture, the evolving political picture in Brazil. Christopher Garman is director of Latin America at the Eurasia Group. I will not go through their bios because you have them, and we have prepared some short bios. I hope that you have a chance to read them. Next we will hear from Stanley Gassick, Associate Director at the International Department of AFL-CIO, and a person that some of you may know was instrumental about some 27 years ago to bringing then Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a former union leader trying to form a political party in Brazil at that point. So Stan was instrumental in bringing him to Washington. And I covered that as a journalist and drove Lula around town. I wanted to ask, Michael, would you like to say something on behalf of the dialogue?
Thank you. Just only that it's, the dialogue is delighted to co-host this event and to work with Paulo and see a lot of friends and and just listen and learn about Brazil. So we're delighted to join with you, and thank you very much, Paulo.
Thank you, Michael. So the way we organize this is that David will start us off with a 15-minute presentation. He has a PowerPoint, and then Chris and Luis and Stan will follow, and I ask them to speak for a maximum of 12 minutes, and then we will open for questions from the audience. So, David, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Paulo. It's a pleasure to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center Brazil program, also co-hosted by the Inter-American Dialogue. And to look at Brazil's political outlook in the wake of our recent municipal elections as to what might be happening in 2009 and 2010. Brazil's electorate right now is 130 million voters. Eligible to vote in these elections, 128 million, almost 129. The electorate increased in its size by 7.4% since 4 years ago in 2004. We count almost 52% women among our voters in Brazil. We have officially 6.3% illiterates, 15.6% can read and write only, semi-literate, and only 3.5% with college education. Just to give you a quick profile of our electorate. This year, unfortunately, we had fewer younger voters registered and able to vote. We call younger voters our 16 to 17-year-olds. Brazil is one of the few countries that allows 16-year-old people to vote. In 2004, we had 3.7 million of these younger voters. At this age, voting is voluntary, not obligatory. And this year, we had only 2.9 million. So many of our researchers are trying to explain why less younger people were eligible to vote this year. We had elections in 5,563 municipalities. 145 had only one candidate, and 41 had exclusively women candidates. Of the total number of candidates for mayor, we had a little over 15,000 altogether, and city council, 345,000 candidates for city council. We use an electronic voting machine in Brazil, and I could not resist presenting this to you today because, as you know, last Tuesday there were considerable problems with the new electronic voting machines that were being tested out and used here in the United States. And as you know, the U.S. has a variety of different voting mechanisms, all the way from paper ballots to very sophisticated, expensive touch-tone screens. Our electronic voting machine is a very simple 486 chip, first tried out in 1996 and then used extensively in 98 and exclusively nationwide as of 2002. Our first round turnout of electorate of a little over 128 million had 85.5% turnout. Abstention, a little over 14%, 14.5%. As I said before, voting in Brazil is obligatory except for the younger voters and those over 70. The total valid votes for mayor were 99 million, and blanks and nulls were 10.6 million. Re-election of mayors. We've had re-election for mayors as of 2000, so this is our third election where we've had mayors being able to stand for one immediate re-election. In 2000, we had 52.2% of those who stood for re-election were re-elected. In 2004, we had exactly the same percentage, 58.2% of those who stood for re-election were re-elected. Now this year, that percentage jumped up to a little over 2/3. So re-election this year was one of the major occurrences in our municipal elections. Re-election by party, the PMDB had the largest rate of re-election, 24%, PSDB 14%, all the way down to the DEM, 8.8%. The state with the largest re-election result was Ceará, 75%, and Mato Grosso, just under 50%. The first round elections for mayor, comparing 2004 and 2008, we have a second round runoff regulation. If no one gets 50% plus one of the valid vote, we have to have a runoff. So that's only in larger cities, over 200,000 voters. So this year we had runoff re-elections, runoff elections, second round elections in 30 cities. But these are just the first round results total for the 26 capital cities and what we call G79, the 79 largest cities. So as you can see, the PMDB increased its number of mayors elected from 2004, and the PT did as well. And other parties in Lula's coalition, the PDT and especially the PSB, did better than they did in 2004. The parties in the opposition, PSDB, elected a few less, about 80 less. The DEM suffered a considerable reduction to close to 500 on the first round. and the PPS, which is the former Communist Party, Brazilian Communist Party, was reduced considerably. Election for city council. This is a better reading of the performance of the parties, because you're looking at the proportional election. And as you can see on the right-hand column, I have a calculation of votes per seat to more or less explain how the parties did in terms of efficiency. In other words, a party that can elect a seat on a city council with a smaller number of votes is more efficient. And again, the PMDB elected the largest number of city council people, followed by the PSDB, the major opposition party, and the PT. However, as you can see, the PMDB average votes per seat was 1,400, about the same as the PP, and similar to the PL. This means that these parties are electing more city council members in smaller cities. And parties like the PCDB and the PV, which took respectively 3,600 votes and 3,100 votes per seat, indicate that they, as well as the PT with 2,500, were electing city council members in larger cities where the election quotient is larger. This is a quick look at what we call grotões in Brazil, the smaller cities. Cities in two categories, less than 10,000 voters and between 10,000 and 50,000 voters. So traditionally, the PT and some other parties on the left had not done too well in penetrating into these smaller cities. But as you can see, the PT more than doubled its penetration in 2004 compared with 2000, and again increased its share in the smaller cities in 2008. The PMDB declined in 2004 and again increased in 2008. And the opposition parties, PSDB, the DEM, and the PPS, the three parties on the bottom part of the chart, as you can see, did not do as well in the smaller cities as they had done back in 2000 when they were part of the Cardoso government. So part of this is that the Lula government, as of 2003, began a Bolsa Familia, a family stipend program for poor families, which the British call a dole, and that is in part responsible for the better penetration of the smaller cities by the PT and its allies. Second round result, as I said before, 30 cities went to a second round. The PT contested 15 and elected 8 mayors. The PMDB contested 12 and elected 8 also. The PSDB contested 10. These are the three largest parties, and elected 4. As you can see, the DEM did very well in terms of votes, 3.9 million votes. But of course, the DEM elected the mayor in the city of São Paulo, and that's why they only elected one mayor on the second round, but received these 3.9 million votes, as you can see. Again, the three largest parties, the PT and the PMDB and the PSDB, elected the largest number of mayors on the second round. In the 10 most important political parties, we're looking at the results of the first and second round. And again, you can see the PMDB increased its share, as did the PT, but the PSDB declined slightly. The DEM, or the former PFL, declined considerably, and the PPS as well. And you can see how these parties did in the state capitals and also in the larger cities. As you more or less can see, the PT increased its performance in the municipal elections over what it had already accomplished in 2004. So looking at that, we'll quickly, as a conclusion, look at what I call the political outlook for Brazil. First, in 2009. In 2009, the PMDB, PSDB, and PT will remain as Brazil's largest political parties. And we will continue to have a bipolarization between the PSDB and the PT, which these two parties will again be present. This bipolarization will be present in 2010, in the next general elections. The PMDB will continue to have a major participation in Lula's cabinet as the most important party, as part of Lula's government coalition, after the PT, of course. Now, in early 2009, we will have to examine how the elections for new presidents of the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate will occur. In the chamber, the PT in 2007 struck an agreement with the PMDB for a rotation. The PT elected the president in 2007 through 2009, and the PMDB will elect the next president for the next 2 years, 2009 through 2011. The question is whether there will be a quote, rotation in the Senate, whether the PMDB, which has currently the Senate presidency, will yield for its coalition partner PT to elect the president of the Senate. We're not sure whether that's going to happen or not. In Brazil, traditionally the party that has the largest delegation in each respective house indicates the president. So this chart gives you a quick look at the party strengths in both the chamber and the Senate. As you can see, the PMDB is the largest party in both chambers, followed by the PT and PSDB. The Dem have only 13 senators and 54 deputies, and what we call the Bloquinho, which is a collection of the parties to the left within Lula's coalition, have 77 deputies and 9 senators. That would be the fifth largest group. 2009 has a very, very heavy legislative agenda. We look at it. Political reforms are perhaps the most important item on the agenda. Tax and fiscal reform as well. Reforms of the labor union rules, and what I call a flexibilization of Brazil's labor laws. Brazil's labor laws that have been enforced since the 1930s and 40s. Political reforms. The idea is to strengthen political parties in Brazil and perhaps reduce the number of parties in the Congress. The first 5 items have to do with that, strengthening the political parties. Number 1, close the proportional representation list for deputies. Brazil is one of the few countries that uses proportional representation, that uses an open list. And this produces intense competition within each party list, and not too much competition among party lists. The other idea is that Congress would regulate party loyalty, about party switching. It's possible that they would impose a threshold barrier of 1% as a barrier. Any party not achieving 1% of the valid vote would be eliminated and wouldn't elect anyone. Fourth, to prohibit proportional representation coalitions altogether. So there would be no more coalitions for deputy, only coalitions for majority office, president, senator, governor, mayor, etc. Number 5, a novel idea is to calculate the TV time. In Brazil, we have a free campaign hour that the parties can use 2 months before each election. And the proportion of that hour, the time is divided among the coalitions, depending on the size of the number of deputies in each coalition. But the idea would be that the TV time would be tied to the largest party in the coalition and not the total size of the coalition itself. Thus, the PMDB would be extremely coveted as a coalition partner because it has the largest number of deputies, and the TV time would be then tied to the size of the PMDB. 2 other points that they may be looking at in the political reform would be the exclusive public campaign finance and prohibit all types of private contributions from individuals and from firms. I'm not sure exactly how that might operate if that's in effect in 2010. And number 7, perhaps transforming obligatory voting into voluntary voting, another possibility. Consequences for 2010. Number 1, PMDB will continue to be Brazil's largest party. However, it has no viable presidential candidate at this point and should become the most coveted coalition partner bride in Brazil. The PT, the president's party, also has no viable presidential candidate right now that we can see, but would try to organize a broad left coalition in support of a presidential candidate. And the question is Lula's coattails in the presidential election in 2010, whether Lula would have strong presidential coattails to be able to pull in the candidate he was supporting. Lula right now has an approval rating in the polls between 70 and 80%, which is extremely high. But if we come into economic decline in 2009 and 2010, for example, some people say our GDP might decline to 2.5% next year or 3%. That would probably provoke a decline in Lula's approval rating in the polls, which is very much tied to, in quotes, the economy, stupid. Number 3, PSDB is the main opposition party and does have a viable presidential candidate visible now Governor José Serra of São Paulo, who was defeated by Lula in the election of 2002. And there is a possibility of what we would call in Brazil a café com leite, coffee with milk ticket, of Serra for president and Aécio Neves, the current governor of Minas Gerais, as his vice presidential candidate. That's a supposition, a very, let's say, not too possible hypothesis, but we'd have to wait until 2010 to see if that would materialize or not. DEM, the former PFL, is a party in what I call meltdown mode, and it has declined considerably from 2000, 2004, and 2008 at the municipal level and also at the national level. Consequences for 2008 looking towards 2010. It is extremely difficult to determine who won or who lost in the municipal elections because of the quite diverse types of coalitions, party coalitions in the municipal elections. For example, the PT and the PSDB are the bipolar arch rivals in Brazilian politics, but they were together in the same coalition in 1,200 municipal elections, for example. Generally, what we can say is that parties who have elected more mayors and more vereadores, more city council members in 2008, will probably elect more deputies in 2010 from a stronger, strengthened municipal base. And parties who elected fewer mayors and fewer city council members in 2008 probably would elect fewer deputies in 2010. Another point is that many of the mayors who are elected in mayor or either re-elected or elected mayors of larger cities are now in very good position to run for either governor or senator in the 2010 elections. I mentioned the other reforms that were on the docket, especially tax and fiscal reform, but because Brazil is going through an economic crisis right now, many governors and mayors are counseling the Congress and the President to postpone any tax or fiscal reform because it's possible that Brazil might have reduced tax revenues next year if GDP goes down. Also on labor legislation reform and reform of rules for labor union organization, this is a very, perhaps in quotes, painful reform for many workers because it might reduce workers' rights and prerogatives traditionally over the last 50 or 60 years. But we have a very, very high level of social overhead. If you're going to hire a worker with a formal signed contract in Brazil, you have to put away 103% of his or her salary toward the social overhead that you're going to have to pay on that worker, which is extremely high. I'm not sure exactly what social overhead payments by employers are here in Brazil, but I'm sure it's not here in the U.S., not that high. Argentina reduced the social overhead payments on workers during Menen's administration down to about 55%, for example. So in Brazil, the word is, we're not going to take away your labor rights. We're going to allow the flexibilization of your labor rights to be negotiated. Your union would negotiate this with your employer to maintain your jobs. So there's some doubt whether in 1 year before the next election, Congress would have the courage to flexibilize labor rights in a labor reform. So that's more or less what I have to say about political outlook in Brazil, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Yes, Chris, now, can you can go from there. I think the number, David, that you mentioned, this overhead here in the United States, maybe, Chris, you can clarify that, but I think it's between 10 and 15%, right, in the United States. The contribuições sociais, the social overhead.
Oh, the number here in the U.S. compared to Brazil?
All costs you incur with a
All
worker.
costs, I think
Which is Social
it's around
Security
15%.
and vacation and all that.
Well, thank you.
Collective bargaining agreement.
Well, thank you first for the invitation to speak here. It's a pleasure, and I think it's a particularly good moment to have a panel like this. We not only have just emerged from a local election, which will at least shape some of the parameters of the 2010 election and the political landscape in Brazil, but more importantly, we're holding this conference at a moment where kind of the economic agenda and the economic outlook for Brazil as all of emerging markets and the developed countries is changing radically, given the current economic crisis. So what I wanted to do today is just kind of discuss, at least have 4 talking points here, or 4 messages that I'd like to convey as to how I see the political outlook in Brazil changing in light of both of these events. Very quickly, the 4 I think that I want to highlight is number 1. The local elections certainly will be influential for the 2010 general election. They shape political expectations in Brasilia. But it's important to highlight what they won't shape. And I think it's a mistake to look at the outcome of these local elections as a leading indicator for how voters will lean in the 2010 presidential race. I think this is something that Professor Fleischer made, at least I wanted to highlight, that's one thing that he did not highlight in his presentation, that the outcome, for example, in the capital city of São Paulo should be some metric for the extent of Lula's coattails in 2010. I think that kind of analysis is a little bit exaggerated in the press. But nevertheless, the local elections will shape the nomination process within the political parties, and they will clearly shape the landscape for congressional elections in 2010. So I'll comment quickly on that. Number 2, I think that the factor, or at least the variable that will more greatly impact the 2010 elections, is clearly the economic downturn that we certainly will see next year. More broadly, I think the 2010 presidential elections will reinforce an appraisal that most of us have, that Brazil's political process has matured, that there's growing consensus amongst policymakers over the tenets of responsible macroeconomic policymaking. So clearly the 2010 elections will not generate significant concern from investors, but I would like to make the case that 2010 will generate more concern and more speculation than 2006. I'll also explain why. Number 3, just a few quick comments on what can we expect from macroeconomic policymaking over the next year. Clearly, I think that the message is similar to what I'd like to argue in the 2010 race, which is I do think that the current administration will respond conservatively and responsibly. If there's one lesson that we have learned from the policymaking style of the Lula administration, is that the president tends to react in a risk-averse fashion in the face of economic uncertainty, and that's good from an investment climate perspective. Nevertheless, I think that there are some concerns that we should highlight, primarily at least the contours of fiscal policy, and as well the role that federal financial institutions will play in trying to provide credit to the private sector. Finally, just a few comments on the reform agenda, which certainly will be impacted by the current economic downturn. And here, I think the news is a little bit mixed. The reform agenda will be much heavier than most people anticipate, and the crisis will shape which reforms may be placed on the agenda early next year. So let me give a little bit more of flesh out some of the points that I just highlighted when concerning the local elections. Number 1, I think that as Professor Fleischer already made very clear and outlined very succinctly in his presentation, I think that if we look at any metric for how parties performed, I think one thing stands very clear. I think pro-government parties did reasonably well in these elections. If you look at the parties that gained the most seats, they were the PMDB, the PT, and the PSB. I don't think this is an indicator, however, of Lula's political capital. I think that the performance of these 3 parties were a function of really 2 important variables. Number 1, that voters are content with the status quo, more broadly defined. Local governments and state governments have been awash with significant tax revenues, given the higher growth, which has allowed mayors to be able to spend more on infrastructure projects and spending more broadly, which increased their rate of reelection. And number 2, these parties, the PT and the PMDB, they elected more governors in the last general elections in comparison to the prior. And if there's one trend if there's one phenomena that we do have empirical evidence for, is that when a governor wins an office, what we see is that the party of that governor or of that coalition tend to attract more mayors in the next mayoral election. So we have seen the growth, for example, of the PT and the PSB and the PMDB, primarily in the states where they won governorships for. Right. The opposition came out weakened, but the PSDB held steady. and the PSDB got a very important victory in São Paulo. There's one, however, underlying, I think, political trend, which is often underestimated, which really is the flip side of the decline of the Dem in the race, which is the consistent growth of the left in Brazil's political landscape. And we saw this in the local elections. If we look at, for example, the composition of Brazil's Congress, and we add the seats held by the PT, the PDT, the PSB, the PPS, and the Brazilian Communist Party, and we look at what share of seats do these left parties on the left hold in the lower house of Congress. During the Cardoso years, they held around 22% of seats in the lower house, but that percentage increased to 32% in 2002, and it increased to 38% in 2006. In other words, we have a consistent growth of parties of the left, which most likely is a function of the fact that they're increasing their share of local administrations, state administrations, and given that the PT and the PSB did well in these local elections, most clearly they will probably increase their share of congressional representation in 2010, even if the opposition wins office. The point to call attention here is that if you look at during the Cardoso years, that the left represented an important veto player in the Congress to the government's reform agenda. The size of the left will be larger in 2010 than it was in the previous, which means that the PT currently holds 80 deputies. They may elect closer to 100 deputies, which is a lot more than during the Cardoso years. The PSB will also increase their share. So necessarily, any ambitious reform agenda will have to go through the left in 2010. That's a very important point. The second point is that if you look at the demographics of the share of the left, it has changed also consistently. The share of seats held by the PT, for example, the PT is much less a party based on votes from the southeast, the state of São Paulo, Rio Grande do Sul, and increasingly they're gathering their votes in the northeast. The PT in 1994 had 13% of its vote share coming from the northeast. In the 2006 federal deputy elections, they increased to 24%. Clearly, the PT will be more of a party of the North and Northeast than it ever has in the past, and that means that the profile of the party will also change. It'll probably be less tied to organized labor and more tied to voters who benefit less from being in the formal labor market, which means that the party will probably be increasingly more pragmatic on economic policy making. I think that bodes well for at least the reform agenda in 2010. But it also means that any PS administration will have to negotiate with the PT and the left to get anything done. I think that that's what I would probably say that the local elections will have the greatest impact, which is the profile of Congress. It'll have much less of an impact on what happens in 2010, to be quite honest. In 2010, I think in the presidential race, the very few empirical studies demonstrating that the president has any significant impact on coattails for local races. It is driven primarily by local factors like the one that I described. But clearly, the local elections will shape the nomination race within the parties. And here we already have an opposition candidate for 2010, and that's Governor José Serra, that emerged strengthened within the PSDB, given that Kassab won São Paulo. You speak to most party leaders in the PSDB, they don't say so publicly, but Serra has almost a lock in the candidacy in the party. Governor of Minas Gerais, Aécio Neves, will have a very hard time being able to win that nomination, and most likely he'll probably stay in his party. I doubt that he'll jump ship to another party to run in 2010. But what we will have, however, in the 2010 race, and now moving on to the elections, why I think it'll generate a little bit more concern from an investment perspective in comparison to 2006, is that we're going to have more of an open field. And as David highlighted in his presentation, but I want to emphasize a little bit more, is that we will see in 2009 a weakening of the president. It's very difficult to construct any scenario where Lula's approval ratings does not take a hit. They're currently at 80%. If growth decelerates to 3 or a little bit below, that is, we may generate a recessionary economic, feeling amongst the electorate, because carryover growth is close to 2.6% GDP. So anything that gets close to 2.5 or 3 will have a recessionary feel. Lula's approval ratings will probably drop from 80 to something like 60, 55 maybe. He will most likely recover at the end of 2009 and early 2010 to the extent that monetary policy may start to ease and growth will recover. But what this will happen in the political class is that Lula's candidate, Dilma Rousseff, will seem less strong than she is today. It's inevitable. And to the extent that Dilma is not seen as viable a candidate, that means that speculation within the government coalition will grow as to who could emerge as the pro-government candidate. And here I would highlight that the candidate that could generate a little bit more concern from the investment community, maybe overblown, is ex-presidential candidate and ex-minister Ciro Gomes, who currently, given his high name recall, has 15% in the vote. And he could throw his hat in the ring. And remember, in 2002, he did advocate a restructuring of Brazil's domestic debt. He will most likely, follow the tenets of responsible macroeconomic policy making if elected. But I think that he, at least, speculation will grow of whether he will be competitive, right? That's a function, I think, of Lula's weakening. You speak to most presidential advisors today in Brasilia, and they'll tell you that Ciro will not run, that he is loyal to the president, and that the candidate is Dilma, and that he could actually be a potential vice presidential candidate on the Dilma ticket. Again, I think that that's the scenario today, but in a weakening of the president in 2009, I think it'll be more difficult to at least carry through those plans. Macroeconomic policymaking. Why would I highlight some concerns? Well, number one, I think that. Let me just highlight the positives. I think that the current economic downturn and crisis, what it does is that it highlights both the positives and the negatives of policy making across emerging markets. Countries which have been adopted kind of heterodox macroeconomic policies, some of their vulnerabilities will be highlighted, i.e. Argentina. Whereas in Brazil, I think it'll show some of the strengths of the policy making, the trends in policy making over the past couple of years, and most namely that the president and policymakers in Brazil tend to react conservatively before economic shocks, and I think that it will not be different this time around. The president, will remain committed to keep low inflation. If you look at the main figures and advisors to the president that are very influential in formulating a policy response, I think the president of the central bank, Henrique Meirelles, has been and will continue to be a critical figure in advising the president on how to respond. The central monetary policy will come under some pressure, of course, given that Brazil has very high interest rates, and undoubtedly pressure will grow for the central bank to lower rates. But if the central bank does keep rates tight or even potentially raise rates, that's something that can't be discarded, the president will clearly back the central bank in whatever decisions they do take, precisely because of Lula's pattern of being very risk-averse in the current environment. So I do think that Brazil will emerge from the current crisis kind of reinforcing the conviction within the investment community that responsible macroeconomic policymaking is here to stay. Now, I would highlight, however, two concerns. The first is fiscal policy, and that there is an interesting debate within government over how should the government respond to economic policy in the current environment. That the current crisis is very different from the past. That is a crisis of credit to the private sector. It's not a crisis of sovereign government debt. Brazil's debt per GDP ratio will continue to decline, even though a primary surplus result may also decline. And this is primarily because Brazil's external debt has a larger share in dollar-denominated assets, and actually they have gained that the Brazil's debt per GDP ratio has declined with the devaluation of the currency. But clearly, I think that the primary surplus result will fall, and clearly one component of this is that with growth decelerating, tax receipts will drop, but I don't necessarily see a commitment on the government's behalf to actually cut the planned increase in expenditures for next year. I doubt the government will cut back on the growth acceleration program, nor will they roll back the 12% increase in the minimum wage. And so what this means is that the size of the revenue shortfall will most likely translate into a drop in the primary. This year, the primary will go to anywhere to 4.3 to 4.5% of GDP. Next year, it'll probably go to 3.8 if growth is at 3. But if growth drops much below 3, then I think the government will have to make some painful spending cut decisions. They'll probably make some, but not the necessary to make up the entire shortfall. So I do think that the primary certainly has a risk of dropping below 3.8. Again, not dramatic, not something to be very concerned about, but at least something to highlight. And the second is the role of federal financial institutions like the BNDES, Banco do Brasil, Caixa Econômica Federal. They're going to play a key role in providing credit to the private sector in the current environment. Given that they will grow in the landscape, at least I think it's important to highlight how they will administer those funds and what type of sectors they're going to choose. What we may have from the current environment is that industrial policy may loom larger after the crisis than it was before. And then just a few words on reforms, and I don't want to take up too much time, and I'll conclude here. I have always defended that the view that we cannot expect anything of the reform agenda in the second half of Lula's mandate was misplaced. If you look at the actual reform agenda in Congress, it's a lot fuller than most realize. The government has been negotiating silently behind closed doors their tax reform proposal, which harmonizes the state-based value-added tax and creates a new federal value-added tax. There are a number of factors that lead approval of this reform, make this approval of this reform more likely. I think that could be a positive surprise on the reform agenda. But what's interesting is that the current economic crisis may make approval of this reform more difficult, precisely because the opposition is politicizing the issue and making the case that the government is trying to approve tax reform as a way of not dealing with the crisis, which is a misdiagnosis, but nevertheless, it just makes approval more difficult. The one item on the reform agenda which I think will loom large is oil legislation, oil reform, and how Brazil implements a new regulatory framework to cope with the pre-salt. Here I think we have good news, that high oil price environment was generating, kind of inflaming the winds of nationalism and the desire in Brasilia to at least reap greater rents from oil production. I think that in the current economic downturn, not only will Lula be weaker next year, which make it more difficult to approve anything that he wants in Congress, but also the decline in oil prices and difficulties in Petrobras meeting their investment targets means that the government will probably moderate whatever oil legislation proposal that they are planning to send to Congress. And they're probably going to announce the parameters of that proposal by the end of November. So I think that here we're going to, at least it is good that the current economic crisis hit before the government sent a new oil legislation proposal, because it will be critical for the outlook. And then we have, I think that the macroeconomic reforms will get some progress. But in sum, I think that the current environment is one in which 2010 is more open. There are some risks to flag, but no major risks in terms of macroeconomic management and political risks on the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Stan, and I'm curious for your reaction to what Chris just said about this change in the influence of organized labor in the Workers' Party as its base of support migrated from its traditional base northward.
Thank you, Paul. I'll try to actually address that in the conclusion of my remarks, and hope that I don't go over 12 minutes, because I know the consequences of that. Bom dia, todos a todas, and I want to thank the Dialogue and Wilson Center for this invitation. It's really an honor to be able to participate with such a distinguished and expert panel with Luis Pereira, Chris Scarman, and David Fleischer, our Dean of Brazilian Political Analysis, who was Brazil's focus continues to be a very invaluable reference. I have a double handicap on this panel because I'm neither an economist nor a political scientist. My background is simply that of a U.S. labor lawyer with an intense interest in Brazil. I've had the honor of personally accompanying the trajectory of the Brazilian Novo Sindicalismo of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and the Workers' Party over the last 27 years. And I certainly don't harbor the ridiculous conceit that somehow I understand the global financial crisis and what should be done to fix its impact on Brazil. Just paraphrase the great Will Rogers, all I know about economics is what I read in the financial section of the newspapers. And based on my background, for what you know, it's not going to be, my evaluation won't be value-free. I have no PowerPoints, visual aids, technology. I'm the ultimate Luddite. Unfortunately, you just have to listen to me speak. But now that I have my legal disclaimers in place, let me turn to the topic of today. Even though we've been asked to discuss the prospects for 2010, I really would caution against trying to make predictions here. 2 years is still a political eternity in Brazil, and to say that there is only one candidate or outcome for 2010 is too premature in my humble opinion. Also, Tip O'Neill's famous adage applies to municipal elections in Brazil, meaning that the results are not in any way a 100% barometer for 2010. I totally agree with Chris on this point. Although the current health of the national economy and the success of Lula's macro and micro public policies ironically helped to contribute to the incumbent victories in October. Basically, I want to do the following. I want to address one conventional wisdom, namely that the municipal elections put the Lula government's opposition, and especially the candidacy of José Serra, in a powerful and nearly inevitable position for 2010, that the pro-PT and pro-Lula electoral victories were far fewer than originally expected, that the PT did badly or worse than was originally expected, and that the PMDB has now become the single guarantor of the 2010 elections based on its net gain of 150 cities. Obviously, there are shards of truth in this conventional viewpoint, but I think they need to be substantially qualified. Second, I will quickly stress only a few points about the economy, and I will address the conventional wisdom that the global fiscal strains and pressures on Brazil now augur the definitive end of the electoral chances for a pro-Lula or PT plus alliance candidate in 2010. A simple way of putting this conventional view, Lula was just lucky based on the prior good relation between the global economy and Brazil, and now his luck and that of his party have really run out given the world financial crisis. So in the municipal elections, was this a defeat for the PT? The failure to win Porto Alegre and Sao Paulo are very much greatly touted, but also consider the following. The PT increased its number of mayors elected from 411 to 559, meaning a 36% increase, and scored 21 victories in the G79 cities, with populations exceeding 200,000. That's 4 more than in the 2004 municipal elections. As already noted, the Brazilian Socialist Party, the PSDB, unquestionably an ally of the PT, grew by over 80%, increasing its municipal share from 174 to 314 cities, including one of Brazil's largest, Belo Horizonte, taking into full account, of course, the special unique bargaining between the local PT and the PSDB to secure this, with the active brokering of PSDB Governor Aécio Neves, and the deal having to be officially and predictably disowned by the PT Directorate. The PT has also elected 4,170 city council representatives, 37% more than in 2004. And of the nation's 26 state capitals, the combined opposition, including PSDB, the DEM, and the Green Party, won in only 6, albeit the DEM, backed by the PSDB, winning in Sao Paulo. But the DEM also suffered a net loss of 286 cities, with the PSDB losing 84 nationwide. And regarding Sao Paulo and Porto Alegre, I think this was a very difficult and uphill fight to unseat the incumbents from the very beginning, as reliable polls well before the first round revealed. These are basically competent administrations that had ironically benefited from the stable national economic growth over the last 4 years, generating larger tax returns, as has already been noted. In fact, there was a 13% rise in nationwide municipal budget capacity in 2008. And unlike the ABC region around the city, Sao Paulo proper has never been the epicenter of PT power or pro-Lula sentiment, to make the understatement, and Marta Suplicy being unable to secure PMDB support, among other factors, that actually contributed to a liability for her, although she certainly did quite well in poor and working-class neighborhoods. And the stable and balanced economic growth under Lula's watch until now, along with the federal support to municipalities over the last 4 years, benefiting incumbents, over 67% of them being reelected, leads to another important and unprecedented point I really would like to stress. This time, the opposition did not try to nationalize their rhetoric or directly attack the Lula government. As Lula himself said, this was the first time since Brazil's return to political democracy 20 years ago that the opposition did not mount a rhetorical offensive against the federal government in an election. That probably would have only aggravated the net losses of the PSDB and the DEM, considering the president's approval ratings being at 80%. So even though there was no coattail one-to-one correspondence effect between Lula's popularity and PT municipal victories, with Sao Paulo being the clearest and biggest example and further validating the Tip O'Neill doctrine, it is also an error to assume that the overall strength and popularity of Lula and his endorsing a PT plus alliance coalition candidate in 2010 has absolutely no hope of succeeding. For example, it's much too early, in my opinion, to totally write off a Dilma Rousseff or an Aécio Neves if he leaves the PSDB for a broad center-left alliance, which I don't think is totally out of the question, due to his inability to wrest the nomination from Serra, or if he doesn't want to particularly drink the café con leche. As for the PMDB now being represented as the kingmaker, the bride, or whatever, I'm sorry, excuse my maybe being possibly flip, but welcome to the world of contemporary Brazilian politics. Party was a major factor in 2002, 2004, 2006, certainly will be in 2010. Obviously, Michel Temer is going to say that he's beholden to no one at this point. And certainly we know that there have been a number of PMDBs, so to speak. Its victory in Porto Alegre and certainly in Rio de Janeiro, with País benefiting from Sérgio Cabral's active and Lula's slightly more tacit support, can't be considered as sounding the death knell for a broad PT alliance presidential candidate 2 years from now, notwithstanding the immediate disappointment and frustration of PT militants. The remaining conventional wisdom is that the current global financial crisis will cause a drop in the growth of the Brazilian economy in the next 2 years that will thoroughly undermine the Lula endorsement and the Lula effect, making what I just said about there being hope for a broad PT coalition presidential candidate in 2010 all the more unlikely. I totally agree, obviously, that Brazil is not immune from the global financial contagion, with Bovespa and the credit markets, especially for auto consumption, having taken real hits, as well as substantial drops in commodity prices, and nearly 50% of Brazilian exports are as such. But let's consider some of the other facts as well. Brazil's foreign reserves, which it's had to spend a number of them in order to maintain stability in the real, but the reserves have been at $205 billion, 4 times higher than in 2004. And although financial intermediation is low in comparison to developed countries, it is conducted almost entirely by domestic institutions. Only 30% of bank assets in Brazil are foreign-owned, as opposed to 80% in Mexico, for example, and that provides at least some important protection from credit contraction in the international financial markets. Guido Mantega just announced the 19 billion reais recovery package for the productive sector just a couple of days ago, with 10 billion going to big enterprises, 5 billion to small and medium, and 4 billion to credit banks for manufacturing. This, along with reducing the primary fiscal surplus target from 4.3 to 3.8% of GDP for 2009, if that is done, could free up enough to shore up 4% growth rate for the next year. That's certainly the finance and planning ministries feel quite confident about that. The Labor Ministry is actually anticipating 2.1 million new jobs having been created by the end of 2008, with 1.8 million to be created in 2009. And, lest we forget, over 8 million have been created since the Lula administration, essentially since August of 2003. Contrast that with the U.S. reality, with 1.2 million jobs having been lost this year. So Lula's ability to have squared the public policy circle over the last 6 years of maintaining a minimal financial stability, macroeconomic growth, and poverty reduction and decent work will not be, in my humble opinion, totally undone in the next 2 years. As far as Paulo's question, and I'll conclude with this, with regard to declining trade union support, no question one needs to look at the North and Northeast and look at the expanding base of the PT. But again, we can't just look at geographics and region as well. We also have to look at what has been institutional continuity within the PT, and to look at what are also very important constituency representations within the party. And without a question, even though the Central Única dos Trabalhadores, the biggest national labor central in Brazil, does not have an official partisan connection to the PT and is organically linked in terms of its leadership and bases, it will continue to be, of course, a great factor within PT policymaking. So I would not discount Labor's voice with regard to the future of the party. To conclude, I opened with a paraphrasing of Will Rogers, and I'll conclude with a paraphrasing of Mark Twain. Predictions of my early demise have been greatly exaggerated. I think nothing could be truer in relation to Brazil's political outlook and the enduring legacy of the Lula era to the political future of Brazil. Thanks.
Thank you, Stan. I'd like to hear from Luis, especially in this moment, because Luis was at the center of the international economic policy in Brazil as International Secretary of the Treasury, and also working at the planning ministry of the current administration. So, Luis, if you could put our current sort of scenario in the context of this big global economic meltdown.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I'm just a macroeconomist, so this is not a very popular profession these days. Usually we are the guys who predict the past crisis, and we are incapable of predicting the next one, which is the important for you guys. And when you add to that, an economist trying to talk about politics and local politics in Brazil, this is not the audacity of hope. This is the audacity of ignorance. But nevertheless, let me try to get you a bit into the what is likely to be the sort of relationship between local politics, the elections, the crisis. And then I'd like to take a little bit of a sort of broader perspective in history and in politics to see some of the challenges ahead for Brazilian politics for 2010 and perhaps beyond that. I don't think the municipal elections were really fully influenced by the current global financial crisis. My perception is local elections are much more about people's perception of their income, their employment situation, and of course they had already some signals of what was going on in the global financial world. But if you look at, let's say, very simple things about the economic indicators, the employment progression in Brazil, the rise of formalization, 4 million jobs created, widespread growth across all the regions in Brazil, an average income in dollar terms who rose from about $80 in 2002 to $220 in 2008, rise in minimum wage, the increases in the coverage of the Bolsa Familia, the conditional cash transfer program in Brazil, from about 6 million households covered to 11 millions. The lowest unemployment level we had in about 10 years, 13% unemployment in 2003, 7.5% unemployment now. Everybody knew that there was the sort of general context of a crisis, but nevertheless, the money in the pocket of the median voter for this municipal election was still pretty much very real. And I think the results that you have observed is pretty much related to the previous cycle of economic growth and extremely efficient policies and well-targeted social programs than, let's say, the sort of the crisis looming in the background, which doesn't mean, as many of the speakers pointed out, that this will not have an effect from, let's say, the years to come. Now, let's say bringing this to sort of a more broader perspective of the relationship between economics and politics in Brazil in the last, say, a decade. I think Brazil belongs to, let's say, the typical Latin American country situation where inevitably you would have, you have been observing a tendency for popular representation, disadvantaged groups, the poor, getting more representation in politics throughout the continent. This has happened in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, and this is a natural tendency, and this is one of, let's say, the advantage, I think, of Latin America vis-a-vis other BRICS, is that democratic rules and democratic elections did take place in the Latin American continent, and in a variety of degrees produce, let's say, transition governments to, let's say, the center-left, the left, with a variety of nuances, but nevertheless, which is, let's say, I think, an advantage vis-a-vis other BRICS, like Russia, for instance, or like China. So let's say one of the elements of, let's say, a brighter future for Latin America, irrespective of the effects of a financial crisis which will hit us with some degree of severity, is that the political buffers to react in a legitimate way and to design macroeconomic policies with some social consensus about how to do things is there. And to follow on that, I think that the victory of the Workers' Party in 2002 was a very important component of the transition to, let's say, stable democratic rules in Brazil. And more important was the success and the continuation of responsible and sound macroeconomic policies, as Chris pointed out. It was very important that a sort of central left or leftist experience in Brazil was successful indeed in continuing a set of responsible policies. And if you put all this together, if you put, let's say, the work that has been done for the last 15 years by the Cardoso administration and plus the Lula administration, this is exactly what sort of allowed Brazil to reach this global financial crisis in a position of strength, in a position where you do have a much more solid macroeconomic policy framework in terms of both fiscal, in terms of the credibility of your institutions, in terms of the level of international reserves that allows you to sail through a period of credit contraction in the global economy, and therefore to, let's say, be able to be in a situation to smooth the process of deceleration of the global economy without, let's say, having what Brazil used to have without this strength in policies and fundamentals, a very high volatile and very up and down and crisis types of situation which would sort of destroy the sort of the social fabric and put the situation in a much more unstable type of social political context. So there's been progress. It's something that belongs to the whole of Latin America. Of course, there are nuances. Countries in Latin America that had, let's say, less of a structured type of political party type of environment were more inclined to, let's say, make this transition to the left in a more, perhaps, let's say, populist type of fashion. Those countries which had, let's say, solid political representations linked to well-identified social groupings, and I think Brazil is a case in point. I think Chile is another example. We're able, in fact, to sort of benefit both from, let's say, better macro policies and, let's say, a structure of representations that sort of strengthen the democratic transition and the strength of institutions that allow, let's say, countries to go through political to sort of financial crisis in a better way. Now, finally, I mean, is this going to sort of dramatically change with the current crisis? Can we have some lessons, both in terms of politics and economics, about that? My take is that you have, let's say, essentially two sets of political parties in Brazil, the PSDB and the PT, the Workers' Party, who belong in a sense to, let's say, what the Europeans would call the social democratic family. The electoral alliances in Europe or in other parts of the world between different brands of social democratic parties took place in the 19th century. In Brazil, we have some sort of a idiosyncrasy which is that these two brands of, let's say, social democracy, which with many nuances. I mean, after all, we are not, let's say, the continent of Descartes and Hobbes. We are the continent of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So if we didn't have divisions among social democrats, I mean, we wouldn't be Latins. But nevertheless, if you look at, let's say, if you take a little bit of a distance, if you look at, let's say, okay, what is it that really sort of makes so different the values, the programs, the directions, the strategic directions for the countries between, let's say, the two branches of these social democratic parties in Brazil? I mean, you will see that I think there is a lot in common in terms of, let's say, the preoccupation with social issues, the preoccupation with macroeconomic stability. Now, yes, it's true, they compete. And they particularly compete in a very particular spot of Brazilian politics, which is the state of São Paulo, where they have their historical origin, they have their major leaders, and I think one of, let's say, the challenges for Brazil in the future, if, let's say, it wants to sort of conduct more in-depth and necessary structural reforms, some of them mentioned by my colleague panelists here, there needs to be at some point, let's say, a possibility of having a little bit more of a bipartisan approach in terms of policies in Brazil for the medium term for these two social democratic sort of brands in Brazil. Whether this is possible under, let's say, a big financial crisis, whether local politics will allow that, it's an open question. But let's say the trend will work, I think, the history and probably one sort of anecdote which shows that the voter in Brazil is now mature enough so that it doesn't necessarily sort of recognize anymore a sort of capacity for a leader to just transfer its votes to in an automatic fashion. If this doesn't happen, then the risk, and I finish with that, is that, yes, sure, you will have, let's say, a center, a sort of a traditional catch-all type of party like the PMDB, being the sort of a sort of a bride, or say the type of element which would sort of dictate the directions of politics and of economic policies in Brazil for the future. So my sort of inclination is to see that there is an opportunity with, let's say, the next 5-10 years, the medium term, to see much of, let's say, the good work that has been done in the last 15 years in Brazil materialized into some sort of reasonable social democratic direction that would encompass a broader bipartisan coalition that would have macro stability as its core, with social policies in a responsible and efficient way for, let's say, the Brazil of 2010 and beyond. Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite the ambassador to say something.
Well, let me thank all the panelists for their very interesting presentations that, in fact, maybe complement each other and cover different aspects of the current political panorama in Brazil. I think it was particularly interesting to see some of the quantitative elements that were brought by Professor Fleischer. But I can't help drawing some parallel or at least thinking of comparisons between Brazil and the United States, since we are also experiencing a very vibrant political moment here in the U.S. And the first comment has to do with the fact that Brazil seems to be experiencing, in contrast with the United States, a tendency or a trend towards political convergence. I think this is a point that came out in more than one of the presentations. particularly in the analysis that the opposition parties, or the PSDB and others, didn't actually hit the government or criticize the government too acutely because they realized that this would be detrimental to their own political success. Now, this is precisely the opposite of what is going on in the United States, in a way, so that's an interesting parallel to draw. But the other comment that maybe would invite some reaction from Professor Fleischer is that while I was very impressed with all the quantitative information he brought, I was a little puzzled by the concept of a viable candidacy. What actually constitutes a viable candidacy 2 years ahead of an election? I wonder if Senator Obama's candidacy 2 years ago would have been considered viable in the United States, even by a majority of the political analysts around here, or even John McCain's for that matter. So the nature of politics is to be very fluid, especially over a 2-year period, and to name only one single candidate as viable this far ahead of an election seems to be, to me, taking a big risk, especially when you see political convergence in the national atmosphere, and when you see such high popularity for the incumbent. I'm not saying that this popularity will automatically transfer to another candidate, but there are a number of very talented candidates from the PT and others. There's Governors Eduardo Campos, Jacques Wagner, there could be other names also in the political horizon. So just a little inquiry about what constitutes a viable candidacy in Professor Fleischer's understanding. Thank you.
So, and here we go. David. What is a viable presidential candidate in Brazil 2 years before the election?
I thank the ambassador for his comment. The question of a viable candidate is a very open question. In Brazil, political analysts frequently refer to candidates as being viable or non-viable. The PMDB is, of course, the example of the major party, best organized party in all states in Brazil, but has not been able to get its game together to construct and prepare a viable candidate for 2010. The last time this party had a candidate was in 1994. The viability of a candidate is usually measured by his or her stature in survey research polls, which talk about your preferences, you, the voter being interviewed, as to who you might possibly vote for in 2010. And Governor Serra, having been a previous candidate in 2002 and a major figure in the Brazilian politics for a number of years, has a fairly high recognition level among voters. And so his being cited in polls is far beyond any other pre-candidate or possible candidate for 2010. The question of whether a candidate is considered viable or not 2 years ahead of the next election is a very, very good question. And of course, John McCain and Barack Obama are examples of that. We could also remember the Mensalon scandal in 2005, which toward the end of 2005, the survey research showed that Lula's possibility of being reelected had declined considerably, and that his standing in the polls was down below 50%, maybe as low as 40% toward the end of 2005. And so many people thought that he would never be reelected in 2006, had become, as they said, non-viable. However, in the first semester of 2006, that changed, and Lula began increasing in the polls and became a very, very viable candidate for reelection. The question is the candidates who are mentioned or put into the polls, like Dilma Rousseff or some other PT governors, like Eduardo Campos, PSB governor of Pernambuco, and some others, are not registering high numbers of preferences in these pre-election polls 2 years ahead of the next election. But Ambassador Patriarch is very correct in that politics is like a cloud that is always changing its format, and that over the next 2 years, some changes may occur in Brazilian politics, and certain candidates would be more viable and others might become less viable. So I accept your comment as being very, very appropriate.
Thank you, David. While you think about your questions, I would like Michael to make a comment.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to make a quick comment and maybe a question. I don't know if it's a viable comment, but it's a comment anyway. Somebody who follows the Andean countries, it's just interesting to hear these excellent presentations, and just think about the influence of Brazil in the region, and the role that Brazil occupies, and whether it will continue to play that role. I wish that President Lula, in deciding not to go for a third term, would have a greater influence in some of the Andean countries, but I guess maybe that hasn't taken hold as much as it might have. I also think that the whole question of the financial crisis and its implications, the role of Brazil, I think also maybe Chris can comment on this, but has a sort of a broader regional dimension as well. One hears from some of the Andean countries that really Brazil is the test of how it can cope, and if it does, that has a reassuring for other countries as well. So I think it's Brazil occupies that place, and I think other countries are looking to Brazil and how it deals with the implications of the crisis. If the municipal elections don't tell us much about the presidential elections of 2010, they tell us even less about Brazil's foreign policy, I guess. But I guess my question is along those lines. Because Luis talked about this convergence or consensus between the parties, and particularly in the areas of economic policy and social programs. And I'm curious to know if the panelists and others think it extends to also Brazil's role in the region and its foreign policy in Latin America, where there has been a very notable change over the Cardoso government and now the Lula government, and it seems to be continuing and playing an increasingly assertive role in the region. And whether is this just a separate realm, or is it connected to some of the political currents that are happening in the country, and how do people see this in a 2010 period where it seems that whoever is going to be the next president of Brazil is not going to quite have the international image and reputation that a Cardoso or a Lula has had, and what might that mean?
Was there in any of the elections any international flavor? We know of some candidates that use the name of Senator Obama to promote themselves in Brazil. We know that. But other than, was there in the states, like in Paraná, there was something related to Paraguay? In Mato Grosso, there was something related to Bolivia, the situation in Bolivia, as they were discussing in major cities. I am not aware of it, but anybody?
Yeah, I think that the foreign policy figured very low or almost non-existent in the local races. But I think that the question is interesting, right? I mean, although I would argue, however, just as a quick comment, that I do think that Brazil's role in the international arena will only grow in coming years, and that is most likely a function of the fact that Brazil's economic clout has grown, that Brazil has become less vulnerable to economic crisis like the current one. Their macroeconomic vulnerabilities have diminished to the extent that means that policymakers, are going to be less focused on internal domestic adjustments and a little bit more outward looking. Clearly the current, talks on the G20 are indicative to the extent that any solution to the current crisis maybe have to come through a negotiation with a larger set of countries outside the G7. Brazil will figure in that group with Mexico in the region. So I think that Brazil, and to the extent that their economic degrees of freedom increase, that means that Brazil can also play a larger regional role. And here, I would say that, the Brazil's National Development Bank, the BNDES, the amount of credit operations that they're extending has grown significantly over the past 4 to 5 years. Luciano Coutinho is looking to extend close to over 100 billion reais in credit operations next year, and therefore it means that the credit portfolio to regional development projects will also figure larger. So I do think that it's more a function of Brazil's economic clout. The nature of their role in the region will grow, and potentially in multilateral forum will also grow. So I actually, independent of who wins the next presidency, I would actually bet that the role abroad will grow because of Brazil's standing in the emerging markets.
Luis.
I think many factors will contribute to, let's say, a sort of improvement in the regional role and the relationships between Brazil and its partners. First, because there's going to be a sort of a general sense of change in the tone of international relationships between the United States and South America. And I think Brazil has been playing a positive role in sort of being a country with a constructive dialogue with neighbors, including with some going through some specific problems with some neighbors, but at the same time also raising into important international events, such as, for example, in its current presidency of the G20, in international forums such as the IMF and the World Bank, a claim for, let's say, a more constructive approach to the role of emerging economies in reshaping the international financial architecture. And Brazil have been able to do this and to sort of take this line with legitimacy because of the homework that it has done. It's in its own macroeconomy. And I think the whole sort of subtlety of the new framework is going to be to approach some of its partners in the Mercosul and some of the UNASUL and some of the other countries with which he entertains dialogue, and to make sure that, let's say, they sort of can understand the benefits of integrating into the international community without Brazil being perceived as excessively paternalistic or sort of being a sort of the guy who sort of gives lessons to anyone. I think we are in a very sort of difficult juncture. We are talking about a financial crisis today, but it's far from, let's say, clear whether this is going to be something that will last for 6 months, a year, or this might sort of be a situation where it might last for perhaps even longer, with, let's say, a chain of events beyond, let's say, the resolution of the credit market situation, before the resolution of some of the financial institutions in the US and Europe, could extend to the real economy, could extend to, let's say, a worldwide recession, and if, let's say, things really get worse, to a Japan-like of situation of even global depression. So I think the cooperation of, let's say, countries such as Brazil in forums such as the G20, where you do have other partners, other emerging markets, China, and so on and so forth, will be an important component for, let's say, Latin America and its partners and Mercosur to play a constructive role in redesigning the international financial architecture.
Just a clarification. Brazil, as of yesterday, has passed the baton of the G20 to
the UK now. The
okay.
presidency of the G20 for next year, 2009, will be the United Kingdom.
And what Brazil's role from here to then is?
You belong to the Troika, which means that, let's say, you still are among the sort of the three countries, the previous presidency, the current one, and the future one, that sort of shapes the agenda for what is called ambitiously a sort of rethinking of the Bretton Woods arrangement, but has to go much beyond what Bretton Woods used to be. Bretton Woods was an arrangement between, at the end of the Second World War, between essentially Britain and the United States, with a symbolic representation of developing countries, but very little, let's say, substance to add to this. And indeed, I think we all realize that we have a tremendous effort to reshape this agenda in terms of linking what is called by technicians, let's say, simply macro supervision of the general state of the global economy, which is conducted by the IMF, with, let's say, all the new things that we need to do in terms of financial regulations, prudential rules for the banking sector, which would sort of avoid the creation of what we saw, which is, let's say, the emergence of bubbles, excessive leveraging in the global financial system. And this is not a piece of cake. I mean, if you really want to get, let's say, into the nitty-gritty of how to prevent a next excessive leveraging of the global financial market, you really need to have, let's say, a lot of good people working together into reshaping this, so that, let's say, every one of us here doesn't have our 401k sort of wiped out in the next future crisis.
I'd like to invite a question by Arturo Porzekansky, who was for many years in this unruly financial markets and now is a professor at American University. Arturo.
Thank you. Of course, I'm going to speak about something else now. I think that the leaders, whether in the private sector or in the public sector, have a responsibility to their constituents to help groom a successor. And of course, when the leaders, whether in the public sector or the private sector, have failed miserably, they are in no position to do so. But here we have a leader who is extremely popular, and who you would think, even for selfish reasons, he would want to have some continuity in somebody who will safeguard his achievements and so on. So we haven't spoken about that. But why doesn't or wouldn't Lula want to, in the months to come, groom or help shape the political landscape in order to have a successor who will carry on his achievements?
Who wants that? Mr. Ambassador, as the personal representative of the President in the United States, you are welcome to answer. Yes.
I think the President has a candidate, and that's Dilma Rousseff. I mean, I think it's very clear, at least the signals that we're getting from presidential advisors. You know, there are other names in the PT, but I think that Dilma is option number one. I think that she is, you know, she could be a competitive candidate, although she has a problem that she has never run for office. She's not necessarily charismatic. And, you know, that to transfer a vote from an incumbent president to another successor is not a, you know, a smooth kind of, it's not a one-to-one correlation. I think I have been increasingly convinced that she could be competitive. I mean, I think that if you look at her in the polls, she rose from 5 to 9%. I think that the game plan within government is to generate the perception that she will be candidate. And I think the viability point is important, because in Brazil, you don't have primaries within the parties. And actually, so whether a candidate is viable or not may not be less important of a question. The question is there a perception of viability of the candidates? That's key to determine how parties are going to position themselves in 2010. And so, sorry?
The PT has tried primaries, right, at other levels. They could try at the federal level if the candidate is.
That's right, they do. Perhaps. But I think that it isn't as open a process and the long process, not nearly like the parties here in the United States. And so I think that the issue is, will Dilma be seen as viable next year? And the plan within Planalto, I think from what I've been hearing, is that if you can get Dilma to grow in the polls from 9 to 12 to 13, that's enough. And if she grows there, then there will be a sense that she will be a strong candidate. Lula will send support to her, and then the intent is to bring in line Ciro Gomes and the PMDB around that candidacy. Now, my only point is that if Lula loses in popularity next year, which I think he will, that Dilma may not be seen as strong in the first half of next year or in 2009 if it weren't for the crisis. And what that means is that will create incentive for other candidacies within the government coalition. Sergio Cabral could be a name that can emerge in the PMDB. Ciro Gomes, as I said, I think could throw his hat in the ring. I do think that Lula will be very strong in 2010, however, because his approval ratings will recover at the end of 2009 and early 2010, right? But it may not be early enough to frame the bids in the 2010 presidential race. But I think Lula wants to keep his door open as well. He can't throw all of his weight on Dilma, have her go down in flames, and then not have an alternative. And so I think that he kind of wants to be able to feel the panorama and he'll try to like throw his weight behind the horse which is the best bet. I think that's the way that I would cast it.
This obviously assumes a V-shaped recession in the United States. Goes down, goes up very quickly. 2010, Brazil is enjoying it, the benefits of a better international financial climate.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. Questions, please? Pedro. Pedro Barra from?
World Wildlife Fund. People talk about the recession, the crisis, and sometimes I have the impression we're talking about a ghost, no? Because to what extent was this crisis inflated by the media, inflated by the financial system? Do we have an idea? Because you talk, Luis, about we can talk about the past, we cannot talk about the future, and I think the present is more or less manipulated by the media. Yeah. Once the banks, once the bailout is over, is there a crisis? Is there a real economic crisis so big as we're talking about the financial crisis?
I wish indeed it was inflated by the media, but when you look at all the, let's say, traditional economic indicators, the stress in the interbank money markets, spreads that reached 300, 400 basis points, showing that big banks in September, October were not lending anymore to each other. JP Morgan Chase, Citi, you had a gridlock in the interbank global market. This seems, let's say, abstract to us, but it has a trickle-down effect on many activities of businesses, consumption, and this eventually reaches in a second wave the real economy. You've seen GM running out of cash. You've seen the dramatic drop in stock value all over the emerging markets and the G7 major stock indices. Now, this, let's say you watch this on TV, it seems unreal, but it has, let's say, an inescapable logic that once you have got into the situation of stress in credit market, that you have, let's say, major financial institutions that have failed, the capital base for credit in the overall global economy has shrunk, and therefore you will have a shrinking of overall credit for the global economy in the US, in Japan, in Europe, and in emerging markets. So what this constitutes is, let's say, an advanced warning signal that credit will be reduced for firms, for economic activities, for you, for consumers, and that therefore you will see an adjustment. In order to, let's say, to adjust to this new reality of availability of credit, despite, let's say, the injections and many of the measures that were taken by monetary and monetary authorities and treasuries, there will be an adjustment in private consumptions in order to adjust, let's say, the current account imbalance in major systemic economies and in particular in the US. This would lead, this is in the making, to a most likely simultaneous recession, which means a contraction of economic activity, of consumption, of investment in the G7, in Europe, Japan, and the United States. And this will affect all of us. I mean, it will affect people consuming in the US, your credit cards, the cost of your borrowing, the cost of your mortgages, and, of course, it will affect us also all the countries that have either financial links with the major mature economies and also trade links with these economies. So what we are looking at here is either something where the crisis unfolds like this, but is not as severe in terms of the contraction in investment and consumptions as some pessimistic may think, or let's say something that can be much more protracted and last for a couple of years.
Yeah, Brazil exports 18%. 18% of Brazilian exports, for instance, come to the United States. Most of the value-added stuff we have, manufactured goods to the United States, as the U.S. economy goes down, obviously, those sectors in Brazil will suffer. And there will be more unemployment in those sectors. More questions. Let's start. Cynthia. I'll go
Cynthia McClintock, George Washington University. Like Michael Shifter, I specialize primarily in the Andean countries, and there the indigenous movements have played a large role in the political arena recently. And I'm curious to what extent the major political parties in Brazil have been reaching out to people of color, recruiting people of color, more disadvantaged people into the political arena.
David.
That's a very interesting question, Cynthia, and we have a intense debate in Brazil right now about what the Americans call affirmative action programs, of favoring not only Afro-Brazilian descent people, but also Indians as well in entrance into universities and entrance into other competitive arenas. There is a intense debate on this. The Supreme Court is going to rule on some of these programs, and the Congress will be perhaps passing some legislation to that end. Political parties try to recruit minorities into the parties and to have them become candidates. And of course, the parties and the election system, we also consider women to be a minority. And I didn't touch on this in my presentation, but the percentage of women who were elected to city council and also as mayors increased very slightly between 2004 and 2008. It's currently around 12% of mayors are women, and about 16 or 17% of city council members elected were women. In Brazil, the women's groups have great hope that Brazil will close the list for proportional elections for deputy, and with a closed list then adopt what the Argentines call the ley de cupos, a quota system for women on a closed list. Argentina has a law that says you have to have a woman at least in the third position on the list, the fifth, and the seventh position on your party list. Argentina increased from about 6% of the lower house with that to about 21% over one election, and now has over 30% of the lower house are women deputies. In Brazil, our women are about 7% of our lower house. So we have initiatives and possibilities of increasing the participation within parties and also to elected office from these minorities.
David, do you see, and Stan also, do you see an impact of the election of President Barack Obama on this, not the discussion in Brazil, but precisely on the representation? Because I imagine, as I was there and I was actually commenting for Global Television that evening, what was going through my mind is, what are the children in Rio, in São Paulo, all over Brazil thinking about this, what they are seeing? Because we are the largest African country outside of Africa. And would you, because this is pure, I find this topic absolutely fascinating.
Well, Obama stimulated great approval and interest on the part of all Brazilians. And as you know, the survey research done all over Latin America showed that most people were favorable to Obama's election, and in Europe as well. I think the only country that McCain did better in the survey research was Israel for a variety of reasons. But yes, the election of Obama has stimulated great interest and support on the part of many people in Brazil, as did the election of John Kennedy in 1960. When I was in Brazil in the early 60s and we visited many rural homes, you would find usually some of three pictures on the wall: Getúlio Vargas, also Pope John XXIII, and in many cases a picture of John J.F. Kennedy as well. So to a certain extent, Obama has stimulated the same type of response or support that Kennedy generated when he was elected in 1960.
Stan.
Yes, Paul, just to comment on this, I want to at least point out at least some of the good faith public policy initiatives in this area that have been attempted under the Lula administration. Again, I think the jury is going to still be out with regard to all the results and but I think it's very, very important to note that this is the first administration in Brazilian history that actually made a secretariat for racial equality and a secretariat for gender equality to give them ministerial status. This also has been, the president himself has indicated his support for a equality law, basically an affirmative action law, which does set particular benchmarks that need to be reached in the civil service and within the universities by 2011. But to get to this, much more, I think, more interesting point, and I run the risk of waxing a bit romantic on this, but with regard to
You're welcome.
the press, thank you. With regard to President Barack Obama. There is, it's not had been recognized perhaps too much in the press here, but there is, I think, a rather important memorandum which was signed between the current administration here and the Lula administration to basically push forward best practices with regard to anti-discrimination measures and racial equality, and the implementation is going forward. I actually think with the Barack Obama presidency now, this memorandum could have a lot of potential for all the obvious reasons of really being something. I think this is a great moment, with 2 years remaining in the Lula administration and with Barack Obama beginning, for this memorandum and a number of other initiatives to really develop a serious discussion and dialogue on best practices, and really, and also certainly the academic exchanges, I think, could burgeon with regard to this area, but I would also hope that there would really be really serious exchanges of discussions and best practices to really develop substantive public policy advances in both countries in this area.
Yeah, it's interesting that this memorandum was actually, I think, activated just a week before the election here.
Right.
In a meeting at the Itamaraty Palace, the regional headquarters of the foreign ministry in Rio de Janeiro.
Well, it's interesting that Condoleezza Rice had a very important role in implementing this.
Yes. Mark.
All right.
I just wanted to follow up on the impact of the global financial crisis on Brazil and the political forecasting that the panelists have done. Given the progress that Brazil has made in terms of some export leading industries, in particular energy, but also in the North region where the export is really the driver of the economy and job creation, what uneven impacts will the crisis have on Brazil that may influence political developments in the next 12 to 18 months as we move towards a presidential election, given that in the last two presidential elections there's been a regional skew to the second round runoffs?
Yeah, who would like to take this one? Either Luis or Chris?
Look, you will have essentially an impact on, let's say, some of the traditional export sectors in Brazil, not necessarily in the northeast, but in Mato Grosso, some of the agricultural production, some of the manufacturing exports. You've seen some already uncertainty regarding exports of Vale do Rio Doce iron ore to China. The negotiations of prices has been extremely tough. Now, let's say the general framework is one where you will have a reduction in global demand for commodity prices. Commodity and also in terms of quantum, volume, and prices. And so Brazil's exports is about 50% manufacturing goods and 50% primary goods. So you will have a hit. There is going to be a slowdown. On the other hand, the sort of the diversification of markets that Brazil has managed in terms of both having Europe, China, the Mercosur, and the United States will mitigate a little bit this global slowdown. And in addition, there is also a lot of uncertainty about what exactly is going to be the growth of trade volume in 2009. Some people are saying there's going to be still a mild growth. If you look at the last IMF World Economic Outlook projections, it's going to be around 2-3% volume growth. On the other hand, you have people that saying there's going to be a contraction in trade volume. So we are still, unfortunately, under, let's say, an uncertainty regarding the scenario for trade. You know that it's going to go down. You don't know exactly by how much. If China continues to grow at, let's say, 8-9%, with the huge fiscal stimulus package that they just unveiled yesterday, it's about $600 billion, okay, to maintain, let's say, growth momentum there at, say, around 8-9%, then the picture for Brazilian exports are much better. China is the largest growing trade partner with Brazil in the last 6 years. Trade with China went from $10 billion in 2002 to $100 billion in 2007, essentially, you know, iron ore, soya beans, and so on and so forth. So again, it's unfortunate that we cannot sort of give you an answer right now about whether there's going to be a huge contraction or simply a sort of a mild adjustment. My most likely scenario is that, let's say, the coordinated approaches that that G7 plus China might engineer in the next couple of months will manage to keep trade growing at a moderate pace, and then in that case, Brazil is, let's say, will have negative effects, but will be milder compared to, let's say, a sort of a global meltdown of trade.
Yeah, and obviously the policy response that is being constructed by the next administration here will be very important for that. Yes, please. Can I collect a few questions, and because we are running out of time?
Yeah, John Garrison from the World Bank. I'd like to speak a little bit more in detail about the role of the Brazil in terms of the BRICS and the G20. You generally hear more about the sort of the leadership of China and India, not so much Brazil, but maybe that's changing now. And in terms of the rethinking of the Bretton Woods, what will be Brazil's specific leadership role?
In the back there, and then up front here, and that will be it, I think. Jana.
Well, actually, he just took my first question, and my second question is: how do you see Brazil's role in This is Rodrigo Valderrama. Brazil's role stabilizing the region in South America as you see more political upheaval.
Jana, I think the gentleman up front here would like to make.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. First is this. How unity is among the little bloc, and for the coming year, is there possible to have alliance or PT with this little bloc? And I will quote derived from the ambassador work Converge. Is there a chance coming time there's a merging of the party? And the second is this: how urgency is the reform of union rule and the labor law? Thank you.
Okay. Would you, Chris? I think you have to leave early. So, do you have a response?
Sure. Yeah. Let me just make one comment about stabilization of the region, which was an issue that Michael also brought up in his original commentary. To be honest, I think that to the extent that Brazil's role as a stabilizer of the region will only be, I think, proportionate to the extent that it deals with its own kind of economic downturn effectively, and to the extent that Brazil's economy doesn't reduce, significantly, that does provide a indirect stabilizing effect for the region more broadly. But I wouldn't overplay, the role that Brazil can have in terms of influencing policy across the region. I mean, I think we are headed to, a very difficult environment in Argentina, that due to a lot of the imbalances in macroeconomic policy there. We don't necessarily see the Kirchners adjusting and correcting some of those heterodox economic policies in an effective enough fashion. Ecuador and Venezuela, as Michael knows very well, are heavily dependent upon oil revenue. Spending has ramped up significantly over the past couple of years. They have become increasingly dependent upon a high oil price environment. So with a lower oil price environment, and in Venezuela, inflation running above 30%, that does pose at least greater economic challenges for Chavez in 2009. A similar story can be made probably in Correa. So I don't really see that that Brazil can actually save the day for some of the imbalances across the region, but only to the limited effect that they're able to maintain growth, at a reasonable pace.
Somebody else would like to answer any of those questions?
On the G20?
Yes.
On the,
Go ahead, sir.
I think you have to be, let's say, optimistic, but also realistic. The center of power in terms of decision making in economic matters is still within the G7, and what, let's say, China, India, Brazil have been doing is participating in a more diverse forum, the G20, that still doesn't have, let's say, an executive power or even sort of, in some cases, common interests. You have divergences of interests between China, Brazil, and India in some matters, agricultural, manufacturing, export, services, and so on and so forth. So I think the name of the game is to get, and I think there is a sort of general perception now, that in all these issues of global finance, of global trade, of the Doha round, and so on and so forth, there needs to be forums that are more legitimate than simply, let's say, the ones that were constituted by the, let's say, quote-unquote, victors of Second World War. And this is going to come. It needs skills, it needs, let's say, good ideas, topics, proposals, but it will be coming.
Stan?
Yeah, I'll quickly try to address some of the points that were brought up. With regard to BRIC and G20 leadership for Brazil and so forth, I mean, really looking at this maybe in maybe too immediate of a way, but I do think that certainly falling back on Luis's point, of Brazil very, very much having done the homework with regard to responsible macroeconomic advancement and squaring the circle, as I would put it, in terms of achieving financial stability, moderate macroeconomic growth, and social justice objectives has actually given real credibility in a de facto sense to Brazil's leadership. And certainly I think that what we've seen just happening in Sao Paulo, it's what we're going to see unfolding this week with President Lula and, of course, Minister Manteiga putting forward, responsible regulation with regard to the effect of global markets, I think is very, very important. I think Brazil will be emerging all the more its leadership in this kind of de facto organic sense. As far as labor markets, trade union structure reform, labor law reform, and so forth, if I had another week, I could go into a great deal of detail on this. But let me just suffice it to say that as far as the union movement is concerned in Brazil in terms of collective interests of workers, if organizational and collective power of workers, is maintained through this process of change, and so that there can be some discussion with regard to what can be done in order to make labor markets more competitive in Brazil. That I think is going to be, certainly from the trade union movement's point of view, this could be a virtuous path with regard to reform. One reform that has gotten through, which actually nobody really pays much attention to, was the constitutional amendment in 2004, which basically now says that for the labor courts to actually then come in and do compulsory interest arbitration, which they've always done on the traditional corporatist system, that now it requires the agreements of both parties. So in effect, unions are going to really have to negotiate, but also what this does is it also provides to strong unions the opportunity of exerting their collective action without having the compulsory interest arbitration measure interrupting their power. So that's one example, I would say, of one reform in which the trade union movement is essentially supported. Certainly the more progressive elements of the labor movement.
David. Looking at Brazil's leadership generally, Brazil has been one of the founding countries in organizing what is called the G20 of emerging nations, and continues to exercise this leadership off and on within the Doha round negotiations, with some disagreements with India recently. Whether the Doha round will be able to conclude anything now in November, December, no one really knows. In South America, Brazil assumed a more effective or emphatic leadership with Lula as of 2003. During Cardoso's 8 years, the leadership within South America was very discreet. But Brazil has finally begun to assert its leadership within South America. And this has to do with another question that no one has yet mentioned, is the permanent seat on the UN Security Council, which Brazil aspires to permanently represent Latin America on the Security Council, which South Africa aspires for the African continent and India for the Asian continent. This leadership, which Brazil began to assert in 2003 and 2004, was very strongly challenged by Venezuela and Hugo Chavez as of 2004 and 2005. Given the decrease in oil prices down to perhaps $60 a barrel, this puts heavy pressure and constraints on Venezuela's continuation as a leader in South America, and the effects of the economic crisis on the other countries in South America as well. With Lula, for the first time, the BNDES, our development bank, opened credit lines for other countries in South America, which had never been done before. This was a great change in Brazil's economic relations and foreign policy relations with South America. And as you all know, there are traditional rivalries. Brazil has been a traditional rival with Argentina, of course, since the 19th century. And so Brazil has to tread very carefully in its assertion of leadership in South America.
Well, I think we have come to the end of this discussion. I would like to thank three people, especially from here, the Wilson Center, Smith, Alan, and Jana, who are the assistants, the interns here at the Wilson Center. Nothing that you see coming from the center would happen without their work. They are absolutely critical, and I value very much their assistance and their advice from time to time, because they are very good. I would like to thank Michael for partnering with us, the Inter-American Dialogue, to do this discussion. Obviously to David, to Chris, who had to leave for another engagement, Luis, and Stan. Thank you very much all for coming, for being here. We should have another 2 or 3 events here, discussions on a variety of issues until the end of the year. And I thank you very much for coming here, and please keep checking our website, because we announce the events there, and we always like to see you back here. Thank you very much.